And welcome to my virtual JaneCon talk. I'm Dr. Lucy Andrew, crime writer, crime fiction scholar, and Jane Austen fangirl. I'm a former senior lecturer in English literature and creative writing with specialisms in crime fiction, children's and young adult fiction, popular culture, and creative writing. And I'm now the author of the Harriet Smith Investigates series of Jane Austen cozy crime retellings. I'm going to be talking today about the relationship between Jane Austen's writing and detective fiction, looking at the ways in which Austen's novels can be seen as proto-detective fiction, and also considering why there's been a significant increase in Austen-related detective fiction in the past few years. I'm coming at this subject both as a crime fiction scholar who's interested in the history and development of the detective genre, and also as an author of an Austen cozy crime series. My debut novel, A Very Vexing Murder, was published with Corvus Atlantic Books in the UK and with William Morrow HarperCollins in the US in early 2026. It's a cozy crime retelling of Jane Austen's Emma, which transforms Emma's mousy little sidekick, Harriet Smith, into a feisty conwoman turned detective who's hired to investigate a murder that hasn't yet been committed. Book 2 in the Harriet Smith Investigates series, which is set in Bath, takes Harriet Smith and her long-suffering best friend and sidekick, Robert Martin, into the world of Northanger Abbey for some more murder and mayhem, and that will be out in 2027. In writing the Harriet Smith Investigates series, I'm contributing to a long tradition of Jane Austen retellings, which has included in recent years a significant growth of the subgenre of detective fiction Austen retellings. P.D. James's Death Comes to Pemberley, a sequel to Pride and Prejudice in which Captain Denny is murdered and George Wickham is the prime suspect, is probably the best known example. Other examples include Annette Purdy Pugh's A Murder at Rosings, which has one of the best openings of a blurb I've ever encountered. When Mr. Collins is found stabbed to death in Lady Catherine de Bourgh's garden, how could we resist reading on? Kelly Gardner and Shamini Kumar's Miss Caroline Bingley Private Detective was released in April 2025, and The Murder of Mr. Wickham, which does exactly what it says on the tin, is the first book in Claudia Gray's ongoing Mr. Darcy and Miss Tilney series, in which the Darcy's eldest son Jonathan teams up with Catherine and Henry Tilney's daughter Juliet and brings together characters from several of Austen's novels. Another series that does this is Tirzah Price's young adult Jane Austen murder mystery series, with the wonderfully titled Pride and Premeditation, in which Lizzie Bennet strives to solve a murder whilst working for her father's law firm. Sense and Second Degree Murder, in which the Dashwood sisters work for a private detective agency, and my personal favourite, Manslaughter Park, in which Fanny Price is an artist and becomes an amateur investigator at Mansfield Art Emporium when her uncle is murdered. And then there are series in which Jane Austen herself appears as the detective protagonist, starting with Stephanie Barron's Jane Austen Mystery Series, a 15-book series running from 1996 to 2023. And as this series ended, another began with Jessica Bull's Miss Austen Investigates, with the first book published in 2024. And book 4 is coming out in 2026. But why so many Austen detective retellings? Well, Austen and crime isn't such a strange idea. Susanna Fullerton's book Jane Austen and Crime from 2004 delves into the criminal context of the world in which Jane Austen lived and the crimes that are included within her work, and it's well worth a read. Crime was as omnipresent in the Regency period as it is today, Although, of course, what constitutes a criminal act has changed drastically over time, as has the method of punishment for many crimes. But detective retellings that feature Austen and her characters are inevitably centred around murder, and there are no murders in Austen's original novels. Unsolved turkey thefts, yes, but murders, no. So what is it about Austen's work that lends itself to the detective fiction genre? What makes the Austen heroine, and indeed Austen herself, qualified to solve a murder? These are the questions I'm going to attempt to answer today by looking at my favourite Austen novel, and the one that I think has the closest links to detective fiction, and that, of course, is Emma. Now, Austen's life and work, of course, predates what is commonly thought of as the origins of detective fiction, although not by much. While detective fiction really took off in a big way in the 1890s with Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories in the Strand magazine, many crime fiction scholars pinpoint the work of Edgar Allan Poe in his short stories of C. Auguste Dupin in the 1840s as the birth of detective fiction, starting with The Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841. Heather Worthington actually places the origins of detective fiction earlier than this in the 1830s, with the appearance of stories of professionals, doctors and lawyers initially, and then policemen in detective roles in fiction. So Jane Austen's work is only published 2 decades before the detective genre starts to take shape in Britain. The Metropolitan Police Force was established in 1829, although it was more about prevention than detection in its earliest form. But the detective department was formed in 1842, so it makes sense that fiction began to focus on detective characters, including policemen, around this time. Of course, women didn't enter the police force until the early 20th century in the UK, but female detectives in crime fiction appeared as early as the 1860s in Britain, with Mrs. Pascal in William Stevens Haywood's Revelations of a Lady Detective, and Mrs. Gladden in Andrew Forrester Jr.'s The Female Detective, both from 1864. In their book The Lady Investigates, Patricia Craig and Mary Cadogan observe that these 2 women took up detective work as an escape from the dreadful alternative of genteel poverty. Many other fictional investigators of the long 19th century followed suit, taking up the role of professional private detective or police agent for financial reasons. In the absence of a male protector and provider, 19th century female investigators in fiction were often forced to rely on their own innate detective skills in order to survive, either for financial reasons or from a personal desire to acquit a male relative who had been unjustly accused of a crime. Valeria Woodville in Wilkie Collins's The Law and the Lady from 1875 is a good example of the latter, as she attempts to prove her husband innocent of the murder of his first wife. Furthermore, as Adrian E. Gavin observes, those female sleuths who work to restore masculine honour and those who are young and attractive generally cease detecting once they solve their first cases or marry. Frequently, therefore, early female investigators in crime fiction step into the detective role, an apparently masculine trade, as a temporary means to an end, a way to restore patriarchal norms where possible, either through the acquittal of a male relative or indirectly through finding a husband in the course of their investigations. These early female detectives investigate within the domestic space and closed communities, something that's also common in Golden Age detective fiction between the wars, with figures such as Agatha Christie's Miss Marple in the village of St Mary Mead. These female detectives slip into these spaces as servants, ladies' companions, or newcomers to the community, becoming what I would term inside outsiders. That is, people who are marginalised figures in some way, for example, through class, poverty, or marital status, and are outsiders to the community, but have managed to enter into the physical and social space of that community. They are also characters who rely on their detective work for their own survival, future prospects, and prosperity. This makes them ideal investigators as they're highly motivated. They have easy access to the community in which they're investigating, but as an outsider to that community, they're able to observe the behaviour of its inhabitants more objectively. And also their lowly or outsider status means that they have a level of invisibility in the community, which makes it easier for them to get on with their investigations undetected. Miss Marple works along the same lines. She's a member of the community, but her spinster status codes her as an outsider of sorts, and she's often underestimated by those around her as she quietly and objectively observes the behaviour of her neighbours. Jane Austen herself fits into this mould of the inside outsider, which perhaps explains why she works so well as a detective figure in fiction. She's an outsider in terms of her spinster identity, her wit and arch commentary on society. Being a female writer, her novels weren't published under her name during her lifetime. She also sometimes strayed from expectations of polite society in the comments she made, as we see in some of her letters to her sister Cassandra. And in fact, Cassandra destroyed many of these letters to ensure Jane's privacy after death, and perhaps to get rid of some of her more outrageous opinions. And the destruction of her letters, of course, adds to the mystique around Austen, as does the fact that she never married, when her novels are all about making a good marriage. Many of Austen's heroines are inside outsiders too, and while they're not charged with acquitting male relatives of crimes, and there is no murder present in Austen's narratives, there is still a mystery to be solved, and one which is very important to the future prosperity of the Austen heroine. These are not murder mysteries, but marriage mysteries. In her introduction to Crime and Culpability, a Jane Austen mystery anthology published in 2024, Elizabeth Gilliland Rand observes that Austen's writing shows us that, to some degree, women have always had to be detectives to determine the character of their suitor. Who is lying? Who is telling the truth? Who might be deceiving others for benign reasons? And who might be obscuring the truth for nefarious purposes? A woman's life can be ruined or ended by choosing the wrong partner and not reading the clues carefully enough. Such is the case in Pride and Prejudice, where feisty heroine Elizabeth Bennet not only has to seek out a suitable suitor for herself, but also has to ensure that her sisters don't end up with the wrong partner. In the marriage mystery, rather than a dead body appearing in the opening chapters to disrupt the peace of the usually quiet, close community, it is, in fact, the appearance of the very much alive gentleman, a handsome stranger, that causes chaos. With the corpse, the mystery that needs solving is who murdered him. With the eligible bachelor, it's who will marry him. Emma Woodhouse of Jane Austen's Emma is an absolutely disastrous detective. I've made a little detective word cloud for Emma of the dominant mystery-related words in the novel. And here are the most frequent ones. secret, which appears 25 times, followed by blunder, which appears 15 times, and deceive, which appears 14 times. Throughout the novel, Emma fails to uncover her neighbour's secrets, makes numerous blunders, and is often deceived. There's a certain irony to this, as it's actually the novel of Austen's which most closely fits the detective fiction formula. In a talk for the Jane Austen Society in 1998 entitled Emma Considered as a Detective Story, crime writer P.D. James, who herself wrote a murder mystery retelling of Pride and Prejudice, emphasises that the detective story does not require murder. What it does require is a mystery, facts which are hidden from the reader, but which he or she should be able to discover by logical deduction from clues inserted in the novel with deceptive cunning but essential fairness. It is about evaluating evidence, whether of events or of character. It is concerned with bringing order out of disorder and restoring peace and tranquility to a world temporarily disrupted by the intrusion of alien influences. There are plenty of mysteries in Emma, centering, as James notes, around human relationships. They are marriage mysteries about who Emma and her fellow residents of Highbury will end up with. Emma has an appetite for matchmaking, but she gets everything wrong. She stops her new friend and protégé, the simple-minded Harriet Smith, from marrying tenant farmer Robert Martin, encouraging her instead to fall for local clergyman Mr. Elton, who actually has his sights set on Emma. Harriet then ends up with ideas so above her station that she declares herself in love with Mr. Knightley, the most eligible bachelor around, and it's only in her outrage and anxiety at this pronouncement that Emma realises that she is in fact in love with Mr. Knightley. The biggest mystery to be solved, however, is the uncovering of Jane Fairfax's secret engagement to Frank Churchill, the man who Emma fancies herself in love with for a while. It's this secret for which Austen plants the most clues throughout the novel, clues which Emma misses or simply manipulates to fit her own narrative, but which an astute reader will pick up on. In this, the book resembles the clue puzzle of the golden age of detective fiction, where all the clues are laid out for the reader so that, if they read closely enough, they can solve the mystery ahead of the detective. P.D. James does an excellent job of enumerating these and other clues planted by Austen throughout the novel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive discussion of the clues in Emma, then I would highly recommend her talk Emma Considered as a Detective Story, which you can find in Appendix 2 of her autobiographical work, Time to be in Earnest. But I'm going to focus on some of the techniques that Austen uses to plant and conceal these clues. In What Matters in Jane Austen, John Mullen pinpoints Austen's technical audacity. There was something miraculous about the fact that she wrote novels whose narrative sophistication and brilliance of dialogue were unprecedented in English fiction. She introduced free, indirect style to English fiction, filtering her plots through the consciousness of her characters. She perfected fictional idiolect, fashioning habits of speaking for even minor characters that rendered them utterly singular. And it's this technical audacity that enables Austen's novels to implement techniques that have since become a staple of detective fiction. One of her tactics is to create an unreliable narrator of sorts by switching between omniscient narration, the reportage of the godlike narrator who knows everything, and free and direct discourse, a technique in which the thoughts and feelings of specific characters are incorporated into the third-person narration. These two narrative techniques are blended together so that the reader has to decode which is which and whose head we're in. Ellen R. Belton observes that Austen's novels contain two stories: the story that is told and the story that the reader must construct. Austen invites us to do this by making the story that she tells in some part a false story constructed for herself by the heroine. Each heroine becomes an imperfect detective, inviting us to do better. As the protagonist, it's actually Emma's views that most frequently colour the narrative, and they're almost always erroneous. So there are lots of passages where Emma's opinion slides into the omniscient narration as apparent fact, and there are clues littered throughout the text which demonstrate Emma's frequent misreadings of situations. One of her most common misreadings is of the relationship between Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax. She is completely oblivious to the secret engagement between them until they themselves reveal it. Although there are plenty of clues to the connection between Frank and Jane, which Emma misses, but the reader might not. For example, when Frank Churchill enters the Coles' dinner party, the description is as follows. In he walked, the first and the handsomest, and after paying his compliments en passant to Miss Bates and her niece, made his way directly to the opposite side of the circle where sat Miss Woodhouse, and, till he could find a seat by her, would not sit at all. Emma divined what everybody present must be thinking. She was his object, and everybody must perceive it. On first glance, this might appear to be a fairly innocuous passage of omniscient narration, a factual assertion of Frank's progress through the room. But the phrase en passant is actually Emma's interpretation of events slipping through. We're seeing the scene through her eyes, and she sees herself as Frank's first object. And therefore, in her eyes, his attention to Jane Fairfax is incidental and unimportant. In reality, however, it shows us that he is actually distinguishing Jane by greeting her first. We get another example of this technique in the same scene when Emma catches Frank staring at Jane, and he suggests he is struck by the odd hairstyle that she has and will ask her if it is an Irish fashion. This is a reference to Emma's theory that Jane is in love with her best friend's Irish husband. And Frank here charges Emma with watching Jane's reaction. He was gone immediately, and Emma soon saw him standing before Miss Fairfax and talking to her. But as to the effect on the young lady, as he had improvidently placed himself exactly between them, exactly in front of Miss Fairfax, she could absolutely distinguish nothing. But there's nothing improvident about Frank's placement. It is in fact calculated to ensure that Emma can't observe Jane's reaction. Again, we've slipped into Emma's viewpoint here, and the word improvidently is Emma's interpretation, or rather misinterpretation, of the event rather than a statement of fact from the omniscient narrator. Moreover, the repetition here of exactly hints at the deliberateness of Frank's positioning. The novel is all about the difference between appearance and reality, and the constant transitions from omniscient narration to free and direct discourse muddies the waters, but gives clues to discerning readers to help them distinguish between these two states. Another ploy that Austen uses in Emma is tricking readers and characters alike into overlooking clues by putting them into the mouths and mundane monologues of characters to whom we pay very little attention. And this is where Miss Bates, Jane Fairfax's garrulous aunt, comes in very useful. She is described on her introduction as a great talker upon little matters, and Frank Churchill uses her as an excuse for staying so long at the Bates' house, when in fact he's there to spend time with Jane. he says to Emma, as it was, I was only betrayed into paying a most unreasonable visit. 10 minutes would have been all that was necessary, perhaps, all that was proper. And I had told my father I should certainly be home before him. But there was no getting away, no pause. And to my utter astonishment, I found, when he, finding me nowhere else, joined me there at last, that I had been actually sitting with them very nearly 3/4 of an hour. The good lady had not given me the possibility of escape before. So as readers, we don't expect to hear anything of note from Miss Bates, and like many of the characters in the novel, we might be forgiven for switching off during Miss Bates's long monologues. And this draws upon one of the other techniques that Mullen emphasises as being an Austen invention, that of perfecting fictional idiolects for even her minor characters. Here's a great example. I'm not going to read it all out because we might lose the will, but you can see the huge block of imposing text here, full of dashes and fragments, and all the focus and energy of a drunk aunt at a wedding. We learn to recognise Miss Bates's idiolect very early on. Long, rambling streams of consciousness, overly punctuated, and as a result, downright tedious. Let's be honest, best case scenario, most of us would skim read this. But if we did skim read this, we will miss the little clues to Frank Churchill's attentiveness to Jane and her aunt, another clue of his secret relationship with Jane. Without Miss Bates's mad monologue, we wouldn't know that Frank was escorting them. But she yo-yos around so many different subjects here that we're unlikely to notice the Frank being too attentive clues. For example, she's talking about the ball, such elegance and profusion. I've seen nothing like it since, well, where shall we sit? Where shall we sit? And where, so that Jane is not in a draught? Where I sit is of no consequence. Oh, do you recommend this side? Well, I'm sure, Mr. Churchill, only it seems too good. But just as you please. What you direct in this house cannot be wrong. And then there's the much bigger clue to Frank and Jane's relationship, the blunder that Frank makes when he starts asking about Mr. Perry's plans to have a carriage. Frank tells his stepmother, Mrs. Weston, that he got the information from a letter to her, but Mrs. Weston denies this, and he soon realises that his information actually comes from his secret correspondence with Jane. He tries to cover it up and pass it off as a bizarre dream, but then in bulldozes Miss Bates to reveal that Mr. Perry did indeed have a plan to get the carriage, but that it was a secret. Mr. Knightley, who has his suspicions of Jane and Frank's relationship, notices Miss Bates's words and Frank and Jane's reaction to them, but Miss Bates has been gabbling on in her usual irritating manner, and most people, including many readers, will have tuned out by now. There's another clue in this speech when Miss Bates says, I'm rather a talker, and now and then I've let a think escape me which I should not. I'm not like Jane. I wish I were. I will answer for it she never betrayed the least thing in the world. Jane, as we know, is excellent at keeping things to herself, including her engagement to Frank Churchill. Another technique that Austen uses to present but then obscure clues is good old misdirection. A great example of this is Frank Churchill's trip to London for a haircut. The whole scenario causes such an uproar, and indeed is the subject of a heated debate between Emma and Mr. Knightley, as Frank is charged with being selfish and foppish and extravagant for going all the way to London for a haircut, that nobody sees the connection between Frank's visit to London and the arrival the very next day of a pianoforte from Broadwood's music shop in London for Jane Fairfax from A Mystery Benefactor. Frank Churchill, of course, sent a pianoforte. His presence in London the day before makes it obvious, but Haircut Gate means that none of the characters and probably not many first-time readers will make that connection. So there are several clue puzzle techniques used in Emma to present and conceal clues, inviting the reader to work out what Emma, as the most disastrous detectives in Austen's novels, cannot. But why is Emma Woodhouse such a bad detective? Well, I've been thinking about the power of the inside-outsider as a detective, their ability to operate within closed communities as an outsider, so that they're able to remain unbiased in their observations and interpretations of people, behaviour and events. In contrast, Emma is what I would call an outside insider. She's firmly part of the community in which she attempts to solve the text marriage mysteries, and yet she holds such an esteemed position in that community that she's indulged, flattered, allowed to misinterpret events without challenge, except from Mr. Knightley. In fact, her former governess, Mrs. Weston, suggests that where Emma Erse went, she is right 100 times, which is either blind loyalty or a blatant lie. Emma also finds herself excluded from many of the social gatherings among the lower echelons of Highbury society because she's deemed too superior to be included. She doesn't have the mobility or invisibility of a Miss Marple figure. She also doesn't have the motivation of many of Austen's heroines to solve the marriage mysteries because she doesn't need to marry. As she states herself, I have none of the usual inducements of women to marry. Fortune I do not want. Employment I do not want. Consequence I do not want. I believe few married women are half as much mistress of their husband's house as I am of Hartfield. And never could I expect to be so truly beloved and important, so always first and always right in any man's eyes as I am in my father's. So instead she focuses on making matches for other people, which she does mainly to amuse herself. Emma does have fairly good observational skills, but poor interpretive skills, principally because, as she herself admits, after she realises that Mr. Elton wants to marry her rather than Harriet, she had taken up the idea, she supposed, and made everything bend to it. The irony is that after this rare moment of insight, she then goes on to do exactly what she's just admonished herself for doing, as she lists the clues pointing towards Mr. Elton's passion for Harriet, before exclaiming, "Who could have seen through such sick-headed nonsense?" The reader perhaps has seen through this sick-headed nonsense, and this is why, though Emma is undoubtedly one of the worst fictional detectives that ever walked the earth, Emma the novel works so well as detective fiction. Emma's bad detective work offers the reader the opportunity to be a good detective. And the parallel between Austen's work and Golden Age detective fiction of the interwar period is particularly striking. In fact, Jane Austen's great-great-niece, Lois Austen-Leigh, the great-granddaughter of Austen's brother James, was a Golden Age crime writer, writing 4 detective novels in the 1930s, and the first of them, The Incredible Crime, published in 1931, is now available in the British Library Crime Classics series. Undoubtedly, Austen's work lends itself to adaptation in the detective genre, and we can see detective-related Austen series and standalones being published since the late 90s. This coincided with the rise in popularity of retellings and fan fiction, and indeed some high-profile Austen retellings, such as Amy Heckerling's teen movie Clueless, and Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones's Diary. Nor is the idea of reading Jane Austen's work as mystery or detective fiction a new one. Before P.D. James gave her 1998 lecture on Emma as detective fiction, this ground had already been covered by American scholars such as Ellen R. Belton and Leyland Monk. In fact, where Belton's article from 1988 is entitled Mystery Without Murder, Leyland Monk's 1990 article is entitled Murder, She Wrote, and goes so far as to suggest that there may be an actual murder in Austen's Emma, that of Mrs. Churchill by her nephew, Frank Churchill, so that he can marry his secret fiancée, Jane Fairfax, of whom Mrs. Churchill would undoubtedly disapprove. That's the same conclusion that I came to with a friend of mine in our A-level English class over 20 years ago, and it was this suspicion that sowed the seed for a very vexing murder. But why the increase in publication and visibility of Austen-themed detective fiction in the 2020s in our post-pandemic world? The early years of Austen detective fiction were fairly sparse, with Stephanie Barron and Carrie Beveris being the only standout names of ongoing Austen detective series. And there were, of course, a few standalone titles coming through as well, most famously P.D. James's Death Comes to Pemberley. But the rise of new Austen detective series by Julia Golding, Tirzah Price, Jessica Ball, Claudia Gray, Elizabeth Gilliland, Vanessa Kelly, Amelia Blackwell, and Kelly Gardner and Shamini Kumar in the 2020s, and plus now my series as well, many of which are published with high-profile publishers, shows a distinct upsurge in Austen detective fiction. Of course, in the lead up to the 250th anniversary of Austen's birth, all things Austen started to become more visible and marketable, and it's no surprise that 2025 saw a high volume of Austen detective novels published. But I think it goes beyond this. I would suggest that there are some key social, political, and cultural shifts in our post-pandemic world that might go some way towards explaining what's happening. Firstly, in light of the Me Too movement, it's unsurprising that stories about strong women who are determined to succeed in a man's world are proving popular. Austen's novels have always been about that, but the detective focus exacerbates both the resistance that the heroine faces and the power that she wields in overcoming it, as the idea of a female detective existing within the strictures of Regency society and Jane Austen's fictional world raises the stakes and pushes the boundaries of what women can and cannot do, particularly within the context of an exclusively patriarchal legal system. But the real heart of the matter, I think, lies with the pandemic itself and how it influenced tastes in popular culture. During the pandemic, trends in publishing moved away from dystopian fiction and horror towards romance, comedy, and in crime fiction, we saw an upsurge in a subgenre that has been dubbed cozy crime. The definition of the term is slippery and amorphous, meaning different things to different people, but essentially, I would say that cozy crime tends to feature amateur detectives, is light on blood, gore, and violence, tends towards a lightness of tone and comedic element, takes place in familiar everyday worlds and settings, and focuses on a mystery that the reader is invited to attempt to solve. The success of Richard Osman's Thursday Murder Club must take some of the credit for the rising appetite for cozy crime, both from readers and publishers. And although the first book was written pre-pandemic, its release in September 2020 no doubt added to its success. People wanted to escape into a mundane, familiar, reassuring world in which the pandemic didn't exist and problems were solved by the end of the novel. There are definitely parallels between 21st century cozy crime and the golden age detective fiction of Agatha Christie and co. that flourished in the interwar period. In times of great upheaval, we desire order and a normality of sorts, something that doesn't directly acknowledge the horrors that we're facing. That's not to say that either Golden Age detective fiction or cozy crime doesn't deal with serious issues. Beneath the jokes, eccentric characters, and cozy atmosphere, serious issues are addressed. For example, Osman's Thursday Murder Club series tackles issues such as death, grief, the aging process, dementia, and assisted dying, amongst other weighty topics. Austen's narrative world has a similar effect. Austen tackles many profound and serious topics on that little bit 2 inches wide of ivory, in which she depicts the comic mundanity of village life and the marriage market. Austen's world, characters, and narrative style is precisely suited to the subgenre of cozy crime. In fact, it seems as if it was made for her. Add to this the fact that Austen's world is over 200 years away from our own, where vocabulary such as coronavirus, lockdown, or social distancing didn't exist, then we have a perfect recipe for cozy crime series that don't mention a pandemic. Austen, like Agatha Christie or Richard Osman, is an author whose work offers solace and security in times of stress and uncertainty. In Rudyard Kipling's 1924 short story The Janeites, a group of soldiers in the trenches during World War I bond and survive the trauma of war through their shared love of Jane Austen. Kipling himself read Austen's work to his wife and daughter during the war, while waiting for news of his son who went missing in action. What we have then, in the confluence of the Me Too movement, the aftermath of a global pandemic, a significant author anniversary, and the meteoric rise of cozy crime, is the perfect climate for Austen-themed detective fiction to flourish within. And with it, I hope, comes the opportunity to induct many more members into the Janeite clan. If you'd like to find out more about the Harriet Smith Investigates series or my research, then you can sign up to my Secret Sleuths Club newsletter on my website, lucyandrew.com. When you sign up, you'll also receive an exclusive Secret Sleuths Club article, 5 Ways Jane Austen Paved the Way for Golden Age Detective Fiction. And you can also find me on social media. I'm at Dr. Lucy Andrew on Instagram, at Lucy V. Andrew on X and Blue Sky, and Lucy Andrew on Facebook. You can also contact me via email at lucy@lucyandrew.com. On these slides, you can find all the references to images I've used throughout my presentations. I should say here that the majority of images that I've used here are book covers, lots of those coming from Amazon, or they are images from adaptations of Jane Austen's work. This hopefully also acts as a useful reading list for you, a way to find all the works that I've referenced and talked about during the presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Do check out the rest of the virtual JaneCon program at virtualjanecon.com. There are lots and lots of exciting talks on throughout the weekend of July 18th and 19th, and the recordings will also be available after the events. Have a great time exploring the program.